Do you see a world in which AI could solve the problems of social media's sort of disinformation and moderation?
Not really, in as much as if the AI were to solve the social media problem, the thing is that the AI is reproducing the same problems that social media has, right? So what we call AI these days, right? They're very, very fast computers that look for patterns in a lot of words, right? Huge amounts of text scraped from the internet, often illegally, but we'll put that aside, right? And so we have all this text, and this very powerful computer is looking for the relationships between the words and parts of words.
Luke, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to pick your brains today because I think that the topic is going to be quite interesting to a lot of people. So, just to kick off, would you just give us a little bit of information about yourself, your background, how you got into your line of work, and the sort of work that you do?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. How do you get into the line of work of AI ethics? In a kind of complicated, mazy way, as it turns out. So I'm right now I'm an assistant professor at Western University, otherwise known as the University of Western Ontario, which is in London, Ontario. It's one of Canada's major research universities, and my training is as a historian. Actually, I was not really a computer kid so much, which might be sort of surprising to some folks. But I was always very interested in science fiction. In how societies of the future thought about technology and how that impacted the world. And so I left the discipline of history to do my doctoral work in New York City, in a department of media and communication studies. So that was sort of a big shift for me, and that was really formative to my work and my training. And being there, I worked with a philosopher of technology. There are a few of those around, who at the time was like in a very niche sort of field, which was this idea of thinking about how human values and human ethics get built into technical systems, and how the design of the systems then goes on to shape people's behavior and ethics and all that sort of thing. So this was like 2010. This was sort of not a household topic, and maybe it's still not a household topic, but it did set me up really nicely, as it turned out, totally by luck, for when in 2015, 16, when deep learning as a technology really began to take off and be incorporated into various areas under the kind of name of AI, right? That left me well placed to think about how human values were getting built into these technologies, and then of course how are they impacting the world. So that's kind of how I got to where I am, and now it's every day is no day is dull. Every day there's some new or 10 new stories about AI and its impacts, and it all moves very quickly. So that's a good thing and a bad thing, depending on my mood and my level of annoyance with the news of the day.
It does feel like it's kind of escalated very quickly in recent years. Let's sort of, if you wouldn't mind, sort of starting from the very beginning. If we go way back to the kind of infancy of technology, and I know you've kind of looked into sort of cybernetics and how that kind of started, the ball rolling. How did that all kind of start off, and were there any ethics back then? Were those sorts of technologies commodifying or utilizing human emotion and the human experience in the same sort of way as it is today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that one thing for folks to know about the history of what we now talk about as AI, it has a long history, right? It goes back, certainly it goes back, it's tied to the history of computing in lots of different ways. The history of computing itself goes back certainly to the Second World War, 1940s, famously kicked off by your own Alan Turing there in the
Yeah.
UK, and his work at Bletchley Park and his work on the Enigma machine. The UK was a leader in computing at that time. And those conversations, both in the UK and in the United States, really, we're talking about 80 years ago, set the foundations from a lot of the things we are experiencing and engaging with today. So that's, as a historian, I like to think that far back. Um, Even back, yeah, during the late 1940s and early 1950s, when a lot of these conversations were happening under the label of what's called cybernetics, as you say, a kind of catch-all field that thought about societies and machines and humans and organisms, biological organisms, as systems that they all had sort of similarities, and you could kind of think about how you would command and control them. These conversations about what does it take, what is a mind, right? What is intelligence? What aspects of human intelligence should be duplicated in machines? What aspects of machinic intelligence can we see in humans? This was all happening at the time, and yeah, there's a whole set of meetings called the Macy conferences in the early 1950s, and one of those meetings is actually all about emotion and cybernetics and computing. And one of the things that's remarkable to me is how current and modern those conversations that they're having in 1952 are, when you think about the way that emotion is being discussed around digital technologies and AI in our own day. So long history, there's lots to gloss over. I am writing a book about this, which will be out eventually, a couple of years. But certainly the other thing to say, right, is that even as far back as the 1950s, you had computer scientists, engineers, mathematicians concerned about the impacts of these technologies, concerned about the impacts of computing. So maybe most famously, Norbert Wiener, who he coined the term cybernetics. He was one of the big figures of this period. He really became very disenchanted with the way the United States government was really using computing in its military applications. It was really interested in that funding for military uses during the Cold War, and he was concerned. He was concerned that these systems would be used to for nefarious ends, to control people, to really not kind of support progressive goals. So he became a real critic of the kind of institutional uses of computing and the defense uses of computing as early as late 1950s. There have always been these folks. I think one thing that's been interesting about the history of computing is how often some new technical thing, whether that's personal computers in the 80s, or the World Wide Web, the internet in the 90s, or smartphones in the mid 2000s, or now generative AI and ChatGPT. Every time one of these new technical advances kind of blows up and has a lot of hype and a lot of PR, um, folks forget all of the kind of ethical work or critical work or focus on the impacts of these technologies that happened in that previous set of historical period. So you can go back. I've got a book from 1980 that has about 1,000 references to various articles dealing with computing and ethics, right? Computing in society. So this has been a concern all the way through.
Wow, it's so fascinating because I honestly wouldn't have thought that this sort of stuff was being discussed way back in the 50s, 40s, 50s.
It was certainly, it was, I think it was the conversation was smaller. It was these, like, these guys in labs. It was experts. I think one of the things that distinguishes life now is that it's just these tools are so everywhere, right? They're hard to
Yeah.
avoid.
Absolutely. I mean, it feels like technology has really blown up in the last few years. But when you actually mention, we had the introduction of the computer, and I think all three of us have kind of lived through all the different generations. Like when I was a kid, people didn't have computers in their house, and then suddenly when I was a teenager, everyone had a computer, but it was kind of like
Took up a whole room.
yeah, it took up a whole
Yeah.
room. It was like
Or a whole desk.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, dial up into you'd go on the internet, but then the phone would go out, or someone would use the phone and then the internet would cut out. I remember the computers when it was just a black screen and you used to have to like type in your own code.
That's right. MS-DOS. Yeah, I
Yeah.
started when I was in grade school. That's what I wrote my first essays on, was an MS-DOS machine. So it really, yeah, there's been a lot of change in the last 25 to 30 years.
Yeah, and you're right. It feels like every time there is a huge leap in technological advancements, everyone kind of freaks out and panics and is like, "Oh my God!" Like, and obviously AI, we think of like iRobot and the extremes that AI can kind of emulate the human experience, and so it does seem a lot scarier. Let's go back we'll go back a little bit. Let's talk about social media, and because again, that's sort of slightly different to AI as well. And I know there's a lot of commodification of our emotions and our human experience and quantifying all of those things.
Mhm.
Before we get onto the obvious pitfalls, do you see any positives there in how we use social media today?
I mean, I think one of the weird things about social media is that it's also gone through a set of historical periods, right? So you had the sort of the pre, the pre Facebook era, pre 2004, where you had all sorts of kind of things and people were kind of using. Then you had sort of the Facebook big Facebook, which is sort of, from 2005 through to 15 maybe. And then in the last 10 years, you've had Instagram and Twitter, now X. And now I think we're in a moment where there's a real kind of collapse of commonality in social media, right? I mean, so yes, people use Instagram, people use a lot of TikTok, but um, again, having lived through all of this and used it all, the kind of difference between I went to my 10-year high school reunions, dating me, in 2012, and I thought, are we ever going to need high school reunions again? Because I know everything about all these people. I see them on Facebook. Well, 10 years later from my 20th high school, I have no idea. Nobody's on Facebook, nobody's updating. It's all totally
Mm.
fragmented. So I think that there have been different positives and different negatives over the eras of social media. I do think having a kind of address book of friends and relations was nice back in the day. I think we don't have that so much anymore. And I think that one of the challenges, certainly, as social media companies have sought to collect more data about our behavior and more data about our, more data that they're trying to predict our likes and dislikes, it has meant that those systems are increasingly not just tuned to what we are interested in, but are really tuning us towards being interested in things, right? I think, so for me in my research, a big turning point was in 2016 when Facebook introduced reaction icons, right? These little icons at the bottom of every post. You can say you're happy or sad or angry, right? And it turns out, there was some really good reporting from the Washington Post about 3 years ago that when Facebook did that, they upranked posts with any of those little reaction icons on them, including posts that had angry, right?
Mm.
And so it turned out that angry posts, which hadn't been getting a lot of, they'd been sort of, down in the morass, were suddenly getting pushed more onto people's news feeds. And to me, that's kind of representative of the way in which both there's been this kind of intense desire to kind of gain information about you via social media, and also the desire to shape your experience online, keep you online, right? Keep you engaged, keep you pumping out content, keep you active, keep you connecting with people, without much concern about what that connection entails, right? I mean, the last thing I'll say to this point about the positive. So look, I think one of the things we've seen over the last 15 years with social media, it certainly has enabled communities of interest, let's say affinity groups, to connect with each other, right? So Twitter and Vine and many other social media platforms, at least in the United States, were built on Black voices, right? They were built on Black creators, being there, engaging, talking about culture, talking about sports, talking about politics, talking about all sorts of things. And Twitter, very famously, was really, really built initially in its early years on Black content. There's been lots of research on this, and then the broader, white people discover it, other people discover it, and then they sort of build up. I think that for the LGBTQ community, right? That's also been a space where you find other queer folks online and you connect. It turns out though that unfortunately, one of the other people who these affinity groups have found, it doesn't matter what kind of affinity there is, right? So now you've got neo-Nazis finding each other online and
Mhm.
building networks and connecting more, and then you have the neo-Nazis connecting with anti-vaccine folks, and part of this history is the way that our increased engagement online during the COVID-19 pandemic really supercharged a lot of those connections, some for good, but I think now we can see politically some for ill. And then those connections metastasize, and because again, the companies aren't really concerned about, or they are, but at some level where they used to be. But what they really want is connection. It doesn't actually matter what the values are in those connections, and that's, I think, what's really led us to actually a pretty dark place. Considering what's going on in various parts of the world, including the UK, the United States, and Canada too.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you say, that it's always the main driver is keeping us on those platforms, and like you say, harvesting that data because, and it doesn't matter if we're there for something pure, like just talking to loved ones or whatever, or if it's to be like trying to put together a rally or a political discourse or whatever it might be.
Right. And
Um,
and, rem- and remember, people, sometimes feeling bad feels good. There's been a lot of talk about this, negative polarization. It can be pleasurable to feel angry at other people. That's I think something sometimes gets a little
Yeah, you get that
missed in some of
dopamine,
these
don't you?
conversations, right? Yeah. So
Mm.
yeah. So it's not even that. And sometimes it can be good to talk about people, to talk shit about people with other people, and that's so these are the dynamics that are really playing out on social media.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the fact that Facebook's kind of pushing up the angry responses, it kind of reminds me of like in the comments section, you get people. I just find it fascinating. I mean, I was having a rant about this the other day, wasn't I? Like, you see something online and you think that doesn't really make any sense, and you go straight to the comments, and everyone's like, "Oh, they're only doing it for attention," And then there's this huge like angry mob in the comments, and I'm like, this is why I'm seeing this on my feed. It's not because the content is good. It's because the comments are like just out of control. And it feels like that's becoming more and more, especially with like Instagram, for example. It's a real bugbear of mine at the moment. I spend my whole time like on my feed, like not interested, not interested, not interested, trying to like downgrade all of the like crap that I see. But you see it a lot with like the Schadenfreude effect as well, and like people dragging people down and piling on, like you were saying, Giles, like people like forming mobs, and yeah, I wonder how much the social media platforms really kind of like commodified that. We saw it recently with that couple that got found out having an affair at the Coldplay concert, for example. It's like social media came together for the day, and it almost felt good because it's like, it's giving us that dopamine hit. We're dragging someone else down and we're like hurting other people, and
And people get creative. I think that's the other thing.
oh, there were so many like
I mean,
and
like it's like, oh, okay, look, how am I going to get as creative as possible to get as many likes and
Right.
reach and whatever it might be.
yeah.
And people say things that they would never say in person. They would say
No,
things they would never say to the person in person. And I think that's one interesting thing about social media, right? Is it really does have to do with how, the bodies we're in and how we use these tools, right? And if you're here, you're in your bedroom, you're on your phone, that's really different. It's just really physically different for you in a kind of like embodied way than it is than you're out with your friends.
Mm.
So I think that's also part of it. Yeah, that we we're not engaging with people in the way we would socially if they physically were there, and that's causing a lot of conniptions. Yeah.
It's so true.
Yeah.
Do you see like when you do have these kind of social media trends, like for example, everyone's hating on someone, or like suddenly it's all about right what are their names? Ryan Reynolds,
yeah, Ryan Reynolds.
and his wife. I forgot their name. I should know this. All the drama that goes on social media. Do you see? Do the social media platforms do anything about that? Like, are they behind the scenes kind of like pushing out content like, oh, this is what everyone, or is it literally just the algorithms just doing it for us and we're kind of doing it all ourselves?
I mean, every the algorithm is never the whole story, right? So this is something that a lot of smart folks have been thinking about for a while. I mean, people have been identifying this as a challenge, since the dawn of social media. Some of it is to do with what kind of topics, what keywords, what ideas get upvoted. Also, how your social network looks, and the social media companies wanting to push folks into your feed that they think that you'll engage with more, right? That's the key, and that's partly why they're collecting all this data about your emotional state, your tagging posts, doing keyword searches. It's because they want to know who you're connected to and who you're most likely to react to. So there's some of that. There is absolutely a whole layer of content moderation policies, right? That these companies have been extremely inconsistent on. I think now they've essentially, most of them have sort of stated that they've given up on them. Where this has been a long running thing. What kind of material appears on these sites? Well, so Facebook and Meta, and other companies, they have enormous numbers of folks doing content moderation, often very poorly paid in the global south, in the Philippines and Kenya, right? Making sure that child snuff films, just violence, what all the kind of thing that would be abhorrent to viewers, most viewers, doesn't circulate because people are uploading that. Sometimes they're uploading it just to see if they can. Other times they, again, those affinity groups, well, those are kind of dark affinity groups.
Mm.
But of course, but then there are maybe more, I guess you could say, politically sensitive or politically charged questions of moderation, right? So there was the whole question about, for instance, a few years ago, how did Facebook react to the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar, right? They really, there's very clear evidence that Facebook's decisions or lack of ability to moderate, Burmese Facebook, caused enormous amounts of inflammatory language that led to deaths and displacement of the Rohingya. So, I think a woman, a former Facebook employee, I think, put out a book recently about careless people, I think it's called,
Yeah.
where she just kind of talks about how they didn't really know what they were doing. They had no idea they had the kind of power that they had. So, so it's a mix. I think the other thing you see recently, right, is that creators, and just going back to the point, right, creators are really highly attuned to how to get more likes and clicks. So if they see that inflammatory material gets more views, if they see that, let's say, maybe right-wing, or racist claims get more views, if they're permitted to make those claims within the content moderation rules of the site, they're going to start making them, in part because they're moving to an audience and they see the audience. So there's a kind of a snowball effect where things that people would never say become things that they sort of say in the comments, and then the creators say those things back, and then it really moves political discourse, and it has been moving them in particularly, I think, particularly good ways. So it's a bit of a mix. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess like we've seen with things like Cambridge Analytica, that we are actually starting to see companies utilizing our data for election results, changing, obviously there's been talk about certain countries using our data to harness different things, whether it be Brexit here in the UK or the election in the US with Trump.
Yeah.
That's starting to happen. So that we're getting to a quite high level of collusion.
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny, one of the again, being a historian, sometimes it's not always comforting. It's helpful for me to situate these things. So, back 100 years ago, in 1920, one of the most famous behavioral psychologists, a guy named Watson in the United States, he left academia and joined an advertising firm. So, for 100 years, psychologists, applied psychology has been, wrapped up in the business of marketing and advertising. And that story, this isn't exactly what I work on, but other, again, lots of people do work on this. That story is advertising trying to find more and more precise, granular, datafied, optimized ways of selling to people and getting people to want to buy, right, on both sides. And we've really seen that be supercharged by the amount of digital data that is available online, and also the amount of time people are spending, on digital devices. And so, you look, if you think about it, right, you're staring at what is essentially a small television, like, 4 to 5 hours a day. Nobody stared at a television 4 to 5 hours a day in 1980, unless they were really they were really into TV. So the combination of the granularity of the data collection and the amount of time we're spending on screens just means this stuff is incredibly effective. I don't, Cambridge Analytica made a lot of claims. They had some of which I think were sort of marketing hype. I think the thing to know about Cambridge Analytica is that you didn't need a special psychographic sauce, as they talked about, to do the kind of things that they were doing, right? Yeah. The kind of applied psychology that social media companies have been doing, again, back into the early to mid aughts, the 2000s. That's essentially doing a kind of behavioral and increasingly sort of kind of granular, kind of applied psychological profiling.
Yeah.
Mm. Okay, so in terms of, we'll move on to AI shortly, but in terms of social media, how can our listeners, for example, it feels like the buck kind of has to stop with the individual. Would that be fair to say? Like, how can we protect ourselves from, getting swept up in these kind of social media frenzies, and then consequently affecting, potentially how the country's being run in some instances.
Yeah, this is kind of the $64,000 question, to quote an old TV show, because of course, in some ways, as many with many things in our society, we are sort of individualized. We're told, yeah, you got to do something about it yourself. You got to monitor your screen time. You got to be careful. While at the same time, every social media platform, and frankly, the hardware makers like Apple and Samsung, they are trying to get you to spend more time on social media. So they're simultaneously saying, be careful, but practice good information hygiene. But we're not going to design anything in any way to help you with that. We're going to design it specifically in the opposite way, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that it's tricky. I think, look, certainly when I talk to my students, a lot of them, kind of say, well, I get really sick of social media. I get sick of being on Instagram. I get sick of TikTok, but I feel like I have to be there. So there is, like, there's not always that much enthusiasm, especially among the kind of core demographics using these tools. But look, I think educating yourself a little bit on the kind of business model of social media really helps. It'll help sort of be like, well, wait a minute, this isn't all just objective. It's not like the algorithm is there, an all-knowing thing that's just spitting out things that I like. Actually, this is being crafted in ways that are at least want me to, stay on the app, and maybe worse, are pointing me in particular political directions. So that's one thing everybody can do. I do think it's also incumbent on folks to to go to the powers that be, whether that's your professional association if you're a professional, maybe it's your elected representative, right? Go to the people who are in power and say, what's going on with this? What are you doing about it? This is causing real problems. Has every policy response to social media in the world been a huge success so far? No, not really. And there are a number of problematic ones. But I think we need to try. I think one of the big questions, I know in the UK there's a big question about age verification right now, right? The UK government is bringing in age verification for a lot of websites, for social media sites. Right? That maybe solves a set of problems that doesn't solve others. It maybe focuses on children as a very vulnerable group, which they are in terms of social media and digital tools, but actually maybe puts aside the fact that adults are also vulnerable. We're all kind of vulnerable to these technologies. So I'm afraid that it is kind of in its infancy, and I think what's unfortunate and disheartening is that in a lot of places, especially right now in the United States, right, there's like the tech sector has so captured government and so captured regulators. I think that there's no prospect of any kind of regulation for the common good coming down the pipe. If anything, right, the Trump administration seems dead set on making these systems as doing whatever Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg want, as long as it supports his kind of particular political goals. So that's disheartening. But I think
Right.
in Australia and other parts of the world there are attempts, and I think we're going to see more of it.
Yeah, obviously Australia have brought in no social media for younger people, like
Yeah,
I think it's like
yeah,
13 plus or
yeah.
14.
Yeah.
Um,
Again, I think the age thing, and I think, look, I get it. It makes sense. It's a wedge. It's a place to start. But
yeah,
I always want to emphasize, right, that and we see this borne out in the history of computing. Rational adults are as
yeah.
susceptible to that cat video online or that inflammatory post as anybody else are.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, it's interesting thinking like my generation. Obviously, like you talked about Facebook, and that came out in whatever year it came out, and then obviously like 2012 onwards, there was like a bunch of others started to appear. I feel like Facebook's now like what your parents go on or your
Right.
grandparents, and so I
Yeah.
wonder if there is starting to be. I mean, my kids aren't really on social media particularly. I mean, not even Instagram actually, TikTok more maybe, but I wonder if there is starting to like a bit of a segue away from some of these, like and younger generations may not necessarily be so enticed into a world of Facebook, for example.
Oh yeah, no, I think Facebook is kaput, which is why
Yeah,
Meta, first of all, why they renamed themselves and why they've also been so good at gobbling up rivals. But I think at a kind of 30,000 foot holistic level, I think my concern is that even if people aren't all on one platform, they're potentially going to be on a bunch of different little platforms, and they're kind of doing different things on them. Well, which feels separate. It feels different on the front end. But on the back end, right, you have no idea. In fact, you can be pretty sure that data is being circulated, that it's being collected, that
Mm.
that companies like Meta are, we know that Meta has data on people who don't even use their products because they're connected to the people who do use their products, right? And they those non-users are part of their framework of their models. So, I think media literacy goes away, but it's not gonna kind of solve these problems. I think we're gonna need some social responses at some point. I think, I don't know. I think a lot about as a historian, I think a lot about other eras when new media were introduced and really took off. And the one that really actually scares me the most, or one of them, the ones that scares me the most, is the introduction of the printing press in Europe in the late 16th century, right? 1580, whatever it is. Which kicked off, this kicked off the Protestant Reformation. This is, European history. Well, the Protestant Reformation was produced, the 30 Years' War, which took place from the first half of the 17th century, right? One of the most bloody, horrendous wars that Europe had ever seen, right? No mercy, no laws of war, right? It was sort of religious, but it was also, was fueled by these newly printed pamphlets that people were reading. You could just get a piece of paper that said, "Oh, kill the Catholics," or "Oh, kill the Protestants," right? And it was just horrendous, to the point where at the end of the 30 Years' War, really, this is when the kind of idea of the modern nation state is created as a response, as a way of stopping this terrible violence, right? And the idea is to say, okay, well, if the prince of your little European country is Protestant, then everybody in the country is going to be Protestant. And if the prince is Catholic, everybody's going to be Catholic, and that we're just going to separate. So, that it's obviously printing wasn't the sole cause of this horrendous conflict, but it was a big, factor in it, and it really supercharged it. And so we're kind of in a zone of conflict now that I hope I certainly hope it won't kill as many people as the 30 Years' War. I mean, it's certainly, going back to the Rohingya in Myanmar, it already
Mm.
has killed people, and
Yeah.
it will kill more. Yeah.
Mm.
History has a horrible way of repeating.
And
Weirdly,
also,
yeah.
I mean, we're already kind of seeing. I mean, we talk about like warfare, and I was talking to someone recently about, oh, is there going to be a World War III and stuff? It's like, well, it would look very different because technology is such an intrinsic part of all of our lives. I feel like in some way everyone would be kind of affected by it, and you already are kind of seeing like technology being used in this kind of way. And yeah, it is terrifying, and I see a lot of distrust, I think, in general with people, because now there is an absolute influx of information from all sorts of sources. Some sources to be trusted, some
Right.
sources not to be trusted. It's
Yeah.
really difficult to know which is which. I feel like we're still kind of finding our feet in terms of discerning what to trust. I think a lot of people now are sort of questioning the news and mainstream media over like social media posts and YouTube videos and stuff that essentially anyone can post on there.
Yeah.
It feels like a very uncertain time in society at the moment.
And ironically, like you'd say, mainstream media does generally work to a regulatory system.
Yeah.
Particularly in the UK, we have like Ofcom and stuff like that. Whereas obviously social media is a wild west, and anyone could say anything.
Yeah, I mean, I've had students tell me that they never go to the websites of newspapers, or we have the CBC or the BBC. They never go to those websites. They see their news is completely via Facebook, or Instagram posts. And I had one student say, what I do is I read the opinions under the post, and I triangulate among those opinions and decide what's right. So on the one hand, the student is using their critical faculties, like they're thinking, but the foundation on which they're thinking is made of sand, right? Who knows what these opinions are? So no, that's absolutely right. We have a real breakdown in what we've understood as the information environment of the last 50, 60, 70 years. I mean, look, I mean, television started it, but again, the kind of way, the kind of combination of the technologies and the business models has really made it all come unglued. Because remember, right? Part of the challenge here is that actually if Meta or these other big social media platforms, if they did the kind of content moderation that they claim that they claim they want to do, or that people claim they should be doing, not just around things like snuff films or whatever, but also around factual news or enforcing general terms of service, they would be bankrupt within months, right? They cannot afford to do content moderation at that scale, right? And in fact, the only reason that they can afford to do the content moderation they do is because they're exploiting a global wage differential, right? They're exploiting the fact that labor in Kenya or the Philippines or wherever is so much cheaper than in Europe or North America. So, in a way, social media as we know it is built on global economic inequality, which is kind of a little nuts when you think about it. And so, of course, the solution there, the proposed solution by people like Mark Zuckerberg, is to use AI. Right? AI is going to solve all these problems. AI is going to come in. AI is going to do this with the content moderation for you. It's all going to be automated. And so that's kind of where, I was talking about these moments where the past gets kind of erased from the history of tech hype, right? Well, we hit one of those in late 2022 or late 2023 when OpenAI released ChatGPT. Because we've been getting, I felt like the people who think about this stuff, in academia and civil society, have been making some progress on pointing out things like the kind of question of labor and these folks in the global south. We've been talking about bias in AI, talking about the way that, look, if you train something on historical data and that historical data has bias in it, the system is gonna reproduce and amplify that bias, right? That seems just kind of common sense. And we were kind of getting somewhere with governments and and then it was a masterful PR move to do what OpenAI did, which is to release this chatbot. And it's just completely blown the whole discourse out of the water. And so we've essentially now, in terms of thinking about ethics and social impacts and having a meaningful conversation, we've gone back to square one, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah. Do you see a world in which AI could solve the problems of social media's sort of disinformation and moderation?
Not really, in as much as if the AI were to solve the social media problem, the thing is that the AI is reproducing the same problems that social media has, right? So remember, right? What we call AI these days, right, are they're very, very fast computers that look for patterns in a lot of words, right? Huge amounts of text scraped from the internet, often illegally, but we'll put that aside, right? And so we have all this text, and this very powerful computer is looking for the relationships between the words and parts of words, right? That's fundamentally what a large language model is, which is the basis of something like ChatGPT. So it's a very big language box. But what often gets missed in the conversation about LLMs and AI is that those language models are not they're not sentient, they're not intelligent, right? Maybe obviously, but they're also not coherent. They don't produce the kind of nice first person singular, oh, I'm ChatGPT, you've asked this question. They don't do that, in and of themselves. They themselves have to be trained again by those same low paid content moderator folks in Kenya and the Philippines to produce the right response at the right time. This is called reinforcement learning with human feedback. And it's a huge part of why, how you go from a language model to ChatGPT, a chatbot that's powered by the language model. So, so you could potentially use AI to moderate comments, but someone has to train the AI to do the moderating, to figure out, do the moderating in the first place. So that's not going to solve that problem so much. And as we've maybe seen, right, these generative AI systems, both text-based and image-based, are producing a whole bunch of new challenges and questions, right, around highly realistic AI generated images or text, although actually also a lot of very unrealistic AI images that text that are maybe more insidious. It's just like there's just all this material and you can produce whatever image you want and for whatever political purpose you want. And then the other really challenging thing I think with LLMs, and this goes back to this decision that OpenAI made, the decision to make an LLM into a chatbot and to design the chatbot with a kind of first person anthropomorphic human interface, right? That was a design decision, right? Again, not these things are not sentient, but it was a clever design decision because it tied something that designers in computing have known for decades, which is the idea that when you put a chatbot, when you put like a first person engagement interface onto a system, people really think it's like a human, like they
Mm.
identify with it, they project onto it. It tied that well-known principle to this very powerful language model, right? Which is this huge, a store of enormous millions of people's writing, right? And the ties between those words have been sorted out mathematically, and so that it really does seem like these systems are alive, right? It seems like they are conscious. It seems like they're capable in the way that humans are. And it's putting kind of two neat tricks together, that I think we're still really in the thrall of. There's a name for this. I don't know if you heard the ELIZA effect. This is
No.
a term. No. So the ELIZA effect. The ELIZA effect is this idea that humans project complexity, sentience onto chatbots. And it comes from the name of a chatbot from 1965, going back again, the history. This is what history is useful. Eliza, named after Eliza Doolittle from
Yeah.
Pygmalion, interestingly, right? So we've got a lot of gender questions there. And it was invented by a guy at MIT named Joseph Weizenbaum. And this was a very simple computer program. Again, right? We're not talking AI. We're not talking deep learning. We're just talking about kind of, just kind of like natural language interface. And you type something in, and it asks a question about the thing that you've typed in. It's not hard to do. You can actually go online and you can find emulators of this right now. It's fun to play with sometimes. But Weizenbaum was shocked by how much people were enthralled and engaged by this very simple bot. Even if they knew consciously, that it wasn't a person, the interplay of language and the way you could interact, it really drew people in. So this is what the ELIZA effect is. And so now we've got the ELIZA effect like on Supernova, right? Because we
Mm.
have a much more sophisticated pool of written data to draw from. So I really think a lot of very smart folks, very smart folks in AI. If they say that they believe these systems are alive or sentient, I think, if they're not full of shit, right? They're really in thrall of the ELIZA effect. They've drunk their own Kool-Aid in a way that I think is really unfortunate, because if we had a conversation about the actual capacities of these tools and systems, it would be much easier to have sort of, okay, well, figure out what are they good for? What are they not good for? What are their impacts? How are they impacting things in, say, education? Like, what can we do? Are there uses for them? Are there not uses for them? That conversation will be a lot easier if we stop talking about sentience.
Mm. Oh, God, it's absolutely terrifying. It really is.
Welcome to my everyday. It's kind of
Well,
ridiculous.
it's interesting because a lot of people sort of like brush it off, saying, "Well, it's just a tool that you can use, and it's useful for this and it's useful for that." And obviously, on the flip side of that, a lot of people are sort of worrying about the impact it might have on employment, and like even in the creative spheres, like
Absolutely.
we've had
Yeah.
like writer strikes in Hollywood
Yep.
and all that kind of stuff,
Yep.
thinking like these things are gonna eventually take over. But we should be kind of concerned about those things, right? That's not like it's not
Absolutely.
flippant to say that actually we're worried about those things.
No, absolutely not. I think the sentience thing, I think, is we need to make a really clear distinction here between conversations about super intelligence and sentience, which I think are largely a kind of red herring. At best, they're marketing hype, and at worst, they're distracting from exactly what you're saying, right? Which is the concern about how these powerful tools are going to get deployed by people, right, in different sectors, potentially not for the benefit of everybody, right? So, so look, we have a huge push, I think, in the UK as well as here in North America, to get generative AI systems into education, both, primary education, secondary education, post-secondary education, right? And, and the argument is, oh, well, all the students are already using them, so we have to deal with that.
Mm.
This has never been a reason why schools, like wholeheartedly embrace something before, just because
Yeah.
students are doing it,
They
right?
didn't do that with drugs, do they?
Well, exactly. They didn't know it, or drugs, or punk music, or anything else.
Mm.
Some of these things are not just like the others, but the point is, yeah, that this is an extremely concerted push by companies like OpenAI and other AI firms to try to find a kind of captive market where they can force a lot of people to use these products. I think I saw a stat the other day, that said that I can't remember. It was a very small percentage, a vanishingly small percentage of people said that they would ever actually pay to use ChatGPT or a similar tool, right?
Um,
So it's all very well. It's a lost leader. They put this thing out there. They get people used to it, right? But how are they going to make they're going to make the money? Well, they think they're going to make their money by forcing the public sector, whether it's education, whether it's in government, HR, or whatever, forcing the public sector and getting companies to adopt this at an enterprise level. And that really should give us pause because again, Sam Altman and the guy, the few guys, and they're mostly guys running OpenAI, right? They're accountable to nobody, right? They're not democratically elected. They appear to have zero interest in the kind of social welfare. In fact, they generally espouse some extremely wacky ideologies around transhumanism and around a kind of this kind of AI singularities crap. So I think we need to be really concerned that we're giving this very small number of very, very wealthy and frankly a bit out to lunch people such a huge outsized influence on the mechanics and mechanisms of our societies. And that goes for governments. Look, our government in Canada, our federal government, much like your government in the UK, we have an AI minister who doesn't seem to know anything about AI. He's basically kind of a marketing kind of face for this.
You become a stooge, don't you, for the system?
You become a stooge, and it's it's pretty clear you've been captured by a small set of very vested interests. So what frustrates me is, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, I love science fiction. I think it's fascinating. I think these new technologies are really interesting, and I hate to be the person who always seems to be bringing up the negatives. But I think actually, I think the biggest problem is the system in which these technologies are being developed, right? It's the political economy, it's the businesses. We could have a conversation in a different kind of economic world about how these tools might benefit a lot of people, but we're not in that world yet.
mm. Yes, we are in a very strange place right now. It feels like we're kind of on the cusp of where we were when social media kind of started to come out and people were kind of finding their feet with it and they were like, oh, this is cool, like MySpace, and you'd just play around with your music and stuff. And then suddenly we're all addicted. Everyone's got it. Everyone's getting their information from it. It's infiltrating politics. It's infiltrating all manner of, parts of our lives. And then it's out of control. And it feels like we're at that precipice where it's about to happen with the AI and the consequences could be really disastrous.
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes back to the point, sort of the connection with social media. I mean, one thing is, right, they're both sort of social media and generative AI. They're both sort of they're kind of both coming from the same set of factors. They're both caused by the same set of factors. All this data on the internet, right? All this data about us, the way we interact. All this written data from chat rooms, from Reddit, right? And then of course the point I made earlier about how the social media companies really want to use the data they have to develop AI and push AI. So you may have noticed, I find this infuriating, right? This is also a good example of how social media companies are desperately trying to push AI into everything, generative AI, right? You can't open a Meta product now without them suggesting you talk to an AI person. Like you go on Instagram and you want to message somebody and it says, well, maybe you want to talk to an AI instead. And you're like,
oh God.
no,
And then
I
WhatsApp
don't.
came up with one, and then it was like,
That's right. It's which is that's also Meta. It's the same. It's the same company, right?
Yeah.
So that's really infuriating. But I think we're even seeing even more kind of, I think, fundamentally problematic examples of this. So I've seen a spate of kind of stories on social media recently, about journalists who publish something and they have quotes from real people, and the real people say, I never spoke to that journalist. I didn't talk to them. This has all been manufactured whole cloth by an LLM, right? Because remember, right, an LLM and the chatbots that are based on them, they're not encyclopedias per se, right? They're not. Some of them they can kind of do web search now, but not always very well. They're just like a big word box, right? And so they're just kind of giving you the most typical sets of words and phrases, sometimes in very complicated ways, but within their training data. And so they're not as an arbiter of truth, right? Whatever that is, they're completely, they're not helpful. The fact that they produce factually correct answers sometimes is sort of that's a byproduct. It's not actually built into the way that they work. Um, so yeah, this is just like, how are we gonna navigate um a world of plausible seeming but incorrect information that, again, going back to, like, let's go back to the 17th century again. There was this whole idea that, that the word information used to mean something very different from what it means now. It needs to basically mean, if you think about like Jane Austen, you think about these writers from the late 18th or late 19th century, it kind of meant something more like intelligence. Like you would hear you would hear something, a piece of intelligence, and you'd have to decide, is that, what is that, do I think that's true? How does that fit in with other things that I kind of know? There was, it was much less structured than the
Mm.
way we would understand information today. And I think we're actually already there in terms of that. That's how we need to treat this material. The problem being that where we don't live in the 18th century. We live in an incredibly complicated, sophisticated, highly technologically mediated world where things happen very fast, and there are a lot of very powerful technologies floating around. So I'm not sure how we're going to square that circle. But I think we are kind of back into that mode where we, as you both have said it, we're grappling with how to make sense of the world under these new conditions. And it
Mm.
would be nice if governments helped out a little bit with that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, here in Ontario, in Canada, right? We have very little training for teachers, let's say, right? There was an article on the CBC that said that teachers are desperate for advice about what do you do? How do you, not just how do you incorporate AI in your courses, but how do you talk about AI with your students? Zip, right?
Mm.
So that's something, that's actually something that I and my colleagues are trying to work on a little bit. But there's a real, other than companies saying, well, you can just integrate it like this is this. People know that's hucksterism. They know that's just a sales job, but they want some actual expert guidance. And
Mm.
I think that's really necessary now.
Well, and also I would say for teachers, I was a teacher, marking work, and is this real work? Is this the
Right. Oh
individual
yeah.
work, or
And
is
it's
it?
and it's
Yeah.
I'll tell you, it's worse. It's worse in high school. I know this for
Mhm.
a fact, right? Be um and it's interesting. I mean, again, so one group of folks, who I have a friend who she teaches French, high school French. And it turns out the high school, the language teachers have been kind of grappling with this for a while because we've had Google Translate, right? Now,
Mhm.
Google
Yeah, of
Translate
course.
isn't nearly as good, at producing, sentences as the new, as generative AI is. Although maybe they'll connect them and then it will be. But they've had to do things like, yeah, show stages of work, do some things in person and handwritten. That's something I've done in my work. I gave an in-person written exam for the first time in 10 years last year. They all had to sit at desks for 2.5 hours and write in these exam booklets. And you know what? They did fine. They did
Yeah.
they were it was a perfectly normal distribution. Some people were great, some people were terrible, as always. That's always the way it is with
Yeah.
students. So there are things that students, or that teachers at all levels, are trying to do to kind of address that. I will say that it adds enormous amounts of extra work,
Yeah.
administrative work, right? Like, if because getting evidence that somebody has used ChatGPT is very challenging. But I do also think that the drumbeat from administrators, from the higher ups, that, oh, we have to accept this, we have to accept this, you have to like learn how to use this well. That's not helping, because it's not. I tend to actually think that there are very few useful ways you can use generative AI in education. That's putting aside other areas. Um, in part because I think that, generally speaking, we want our students to learn how to do critical thinking skills.
Mm.
And the whole point of generative AI is to outsource, essentially, cognitive labor into a kind of machine that spits out sentences. And I think conceptually those two things don't really go very well together. But I think that we could be having a more nuanced discussion about that if there wasn't this like drumbeat from top down about having to kind of get with the times, and if you don't, you're a Luddite.
I remember the first time I actually heard the name ChatGTP was because there was a story in the UK where an MP had done a speech in Parliament, and then their speech had been AI generated. Well, some
Right.
of it, not all of it, but partially.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
just think, okay, so how are we going to get through when the people in those places in power are actually using these things?
Well, and I'll give you like an interesting example, right? Because of course, probably 10 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, that speech would have been written by a speechwriter. It would have been written
Yeah.
by a person. So it wasn't like he was going to have written the whole thing.
No.
Maybe, probably not. He's not. I'm guessing he's not Winston Churchill. So
Yeah.
but so there's the labor thing again, right? So there's somebody's
Yeah.
job that maybe is at risk. But I think also the thing to think, I actually think it's interesting to think about that, because I see these LLMs, these chatbots, as basically like they're like text puppets, right? They're like animated characters. And so if you think about them as these like kind of collective projects, right? It makes it really you kind of realize how many people are involved in making an LLM work, right? Versus how few people are making any money off of them, right? Who's benefiting? All the people, right? You've got those poor, low-paid content moderators. You've got the engineers. You've got you, because of the Eliza effect, you were doing a lot of work in making, you're projecting, you're prompting, you're engaging. Yeah. And you've got like the millions of people who wrote the text that the language model is trained on. They're also all part of that animation. So like, millions of people are involved in any single ChatGPT instance. But who's making money off of ChatGPT? Not very many people, at a very small level. So to me, that's like an interesting way to think about these tools, that like there's a real disjunct. If we had LLMs that were developed by and for the public, I think that would be quite a different conversation in terms of their utility and how they do. There would still be issues around that outsourcing of cognitive labor, but it would be a different political economy, a different business model that will be interesting to think about.
God,
Yeah.
it's interesting as well, because when you put it like that, it's literally just a language machine, and that's great if
Pretty
you're
much.
if you're writing an email and you're like, oh, can you just, or writing something and you just need it to quickly spit out some words for you. That's one thing, but I see things online about people using ChatGPT as like therapy, and
That's right.
telling ChatGPT about their day, like using it for company, like just whatever it might be. And also the fact, like you were saying, the fact that it's this kind of like sentient being, quote unquote, as well, which draws people in. And then it sort of starts to take like therapists' jobs, and jobs that really like a computer system has no place in taking. And if you think about all the different jobs that are being taken by this kind of language model, and then like a handful of people that are financially benefiting from all of these jobs, it's like an economic model that's just never going to work. It's absolutely crazy when you really think about it.
Yeah, I agree. And also, these systems, at least at the moment, don't do those jobs very well. I mean, look, of course, like, again, if you're drawing on millions and millions of pieces of text, including lots of books by psychologists and psychotherapists, you're going to get something out of those outputs. But the way in which interpersonal relationships in therapy work, and the way that the therapist, if they're a good therapist, can adjust and modulate and do kind of deep transference. You're not going to get that from ChatGPT. I do think, it's interesting, again, going back to this point about projection. Humans love projecting onto inanimate objects. Like, I think there may be some, there's some social and evolutionary reasons why, we project onto babies more capacity than they have in the instant, because we know that they're going to grow into that capacity, right? But the example I love to give is from the movie from about 20 years ago, Castaway, right? Where Tom Hanks is like marooned on a desert island, and his only friend is a Wilson volleyball, right? And he puts a handprint on it, and he puts a little face, and that's Wilson. That's his friend, right? People see faces in, well, at least in North America, our electrical plugs look like two little eyes in the mouth, right? This is everywhere. So it's not like humans are always going to do this. We're always going to like project and anthropomorphize onto inanimate objects. I think that the concern is who is doing the building of those objects at the other end, and what are their intentions and what are their goals, right? And and I'll say, just going back to the point about OpenAI, anecdotally, so I worked at Microsoft Research for a couple of years. Anecdotally, the idea of putting a chatbot interface on top of a language model is not a new idea, but there was concern amongst some of the tech companies up until 2020, 2022, right, that this would cause all sorts of disruptive effects. They knew, right? They knew about the ELIZA effect. They knew that powering the ELIZA effect with this language model would make people think it was sentient. And so there was reluctance to. There was okay, the internal kind of, we're not going to do that because it wouldn't be ethical. And then when OpenAI did do it and just sort of said, we're going to do it, then essentially, the big tech companies saw a market rapidly receding and threw their principles to the wind and just all did it themselves. So it's, this is part of what's frustrating for me is that people knew 5 years ago or 4 years ago that this was going to be hugely disruptive. I don't know if Sam Altman himself knew, but they didn't do the research, let's say, and now here we are.
All in the line of progress, as they would say, which
ends up being, don't get me started on that. Yeah,
ends up being regress quite a lot of the time. But anyway, I mean, Luke, excuse the pun, it's been a stark conversation actually, but a really enthralling one, and there's so much to discuss on it. It's such a big subject, and I'm sure you have lots of discussions with your students.
And I mean, and one last thing, look, one last thing I'll say, like, again, as I said, like, I love positive science fiction visions of the future. I hate ending on a negative note, right? Like, the stuff that the things that have happened in the last 10 years around technical progress for social good. Look, mRNA vaccines, mass-produced solar panels. Like, we've got some pretty amazing technical things going on that are actually on the way to ameliorating or solving a lot of our big problems. Man, they just need a vaccine for HIV. They just they're testing. So we can use these technologies for positive ends. I just wish, I think the amount of emphasis and money going into these particular technologies is pretty out of sync with maybe the positives they can produce.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. Well, thank you so much. It's been been a brilliant conversation, and thank you for your time. Tell our listeners a bit where they can find you, and
Yeah, sure. You can find me via the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University. My website is starkcontrast.co, which was a I can also make puns about my name, which I do all the time. I'm hoping that my book, which is on the history of emotion in computer science and AI, will be out hopefully in 2027 with the MIT Press. So
fantastic,
amazing.
Brilliant. Yeah, I look forward to reading it.
Oh, thank you so much, Luke.
Been a pleasure. Thanks so much, folks.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.